Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to all of those joining us here in the EU Pavilion, and also a warm welcome to everybody who's joining us online. For the housekeeping, I was asked for you to use your headphones. You can choose channel 1 for English, channel 2 for French, and channel 3 for Arabic. If you want to hear the floor language, it's channel 0. Today marks the second week of COP27, and there have already been a lot of discussions on just transition in the last week, and I'm convinced there's also more to come. The EU Energy Day has an impressive agenda. Maybe you have also tuned in this morning's session with Commissioner and ministers from states discussing on the energy crisis. And then there's further sessions on energy efficiency, wind, solar, digitalization, and hydrogen. So make sure you also check out this session. This session today is on delivering on Glasgow's commitments towards an inclusive and just transition. My name is Moritz Schäfer. I'm an associate director at the global consultancy Guidehouse, and on behalf of the European Commission, Guidehouse is operating the Exchange EU program, which facilitates dialogue between European regions in transition. And it's an honor for me to moderate this session here today and to guide you through our today's agenda. In the opening session with Commissioner Simpson and the ministers of Spain, Belgium, and Austria, they have talked about the energy crisis and also Europe's response to that crisis and Europe's response to the attack of Russia on the Ukraine and what effect that has. And also, almost all ministers, I think, have mentioned just transition in that, which shows what an important topic the just transition is. And I'm looking forward to hear more about that, but also from our international partners and how the just transition is progressing in their countries. In this session, we will hear about and discuss the governance process of the just transition, and particularly the coal phase down in different countries around the world. The objective is to exchange on challenges, but of course also on best practices to ensure that the just transition process is, first of all, successful, but also inclusive. Let me start with a short overview to today's agenda. We will start with opening remarks from Dimitrios Papatanasiou. He's the Global Director for Energy and Extractives at the World Bank. He will provide a global perspective on managing labor transition out of coal. We will then hear from Ditte Juul Jørgensen, Director General for Energy at the European Commission, on the governance of the just transition experience in the EU in her keynote speech. And then we will turn to a panel and discuss different perspectives across the world. And we have Joan Javic. She's the head of the Just Energy Transition Partnership Secretariat in South Africa. We have Surya Dharma. He's the chairman of the Indonesian Renewable Energy Committee for Abindo. And then also on the panel, but he's not here yet, we have Artur Lorkowski. He's the director of the Energy Community Secretariat, and I hope that he can join us at a later stage. The session is hosted also together with the World Bank, and therefore I would like to ask Mr. Papatanasiou to take the floor. Thank you very much. You may come up here if you like. This mic is working at least.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here in partnership with the European Commission, and it's really great to be in the European Union Pavilion. So let me give you a little bit of a perspective of where we stand today in the Glasgow commitments. And of course, when we had the Glasgow agreement about a year ago, no one at that time could see the disaster that was brewing in Ukraine with the invasion from Russia. And that has created a major upheaval in energy markets, the result of which has been in the short term that several countries that we were expecting would leave coal behind fast are actually going back to coal. That happens even in my own home country, where they made really good commitments in Greece to leave lignite behind, but we found ourselves just last summer in Greece stockpiling lignite for the winter. And we see the same story playing out across the European Union. And bear in mind that the European Union has been the leader in the world on decarbonization. So the effect of all that is that the world's available space for emissions is now depleting faster in the very short term and from areas and places that we didn't expect. The implication of that is that we are going to have a much more accelerated and successful energy transition in the later years. And I think it is important that we do not lose sight of the medium and the long-term objectives of decarbonization and the Paris Agreement target, even though in the very short term we're dealing with a really difficult situation when it comes to energy security. Now, let me also introduce a new other idea that is not very well known. The World Bank has been involved in coal transition projects since the 90s. And actually, since the 90s, the World Bank had experience of helping countries with the shutting down of coal mining in several places, especially in the Eastern Europe. And we spent more than $3 billion in investment on helping communities transition away from what was at the time completely non-economic coal mines. So we did learn a lot about what it takes to have a transition that respects communities that have been basing their livelihoods and in many cases their existence because of mining coal for energy. And we also have made mistakes, and we learn from those as well. Now, moving fast forward on all that, we have been working and in partnership with the European Commission, especially in the Balkans, now increasingly in Poland. And we've been trying to figure out what is the way that we can think about helping a transition to clean energy that also treats with justice people and communities that have spent all their lives in coal mining to provide energy for the rest. And again, let me repeat that from the perspective of the World Bank, the just transition is part of our climate change action plan, and we don't think that we can have a successful clean energy transition unless we can also deal with the socioeconomic and the environmental impacts, especially of the coal transition. So, what have we learned so far? We have learned that, first of all, this is something which is possible to do in a fair and transparent way that really benefits everyone. We have come up with what we call a 3x3 framework that essentially looks at how do you assess the baseline of what is happening with people that work related with thermal coal power generation, both on the side of the utilities, but also all the way to the supply chain of the mines and the small businesses and the whole ecosystem that supports this whole chain of coal production. And again, we should not forget that still about a third of the world's commercial energy, is based on coal. So it is a huge amount, and it's both financially extremely important, but both also because you have millions, probably tens of millions of people, or maybe to the hundreds in some cases, once you take into account associated or secondary employment that is related with coal mine, that we need to take care of. So it is a big challenge. And if you look also at the numbers, our estimates are that every year the world, excluding China, is spending about $500 billion for fossil fuels just in the power sector. And half of that is spending that goes to coal. So we're talking about $250 billion, and these are 2019 figures. We'll see how they develop now. So there's a huge amount of spending that goes into recurrent extraction and burning of coal. And that means that if we want to have a switch and take that to zero in the next couple of decades, the first thing that we need to do is plan for it. Make sure that we have a good understanding about who is involved in it and how they will be impacted with the transition. Once we have the baseline, then we need to start thinking about what alternative options we can create, especially for employment and support for social protection for the communities that will be affected by losing this stream of income. And then we have, of course, to think very aggressively about how can we extract value from the assets that will remain dormant in terms of coal transition, but still are quite valuable when it comes to their position in the network, for instance, when it comes to power plants, and what can happen in terms of how can you repurpose, in some cases, even the coal mines themselves. So we have to think about the people, we have to think about the communities, we have to think about the assets, we have to get a good understanding of where we stand today, and we have developed a whole methodology about how to do that assessment. And then we need to make plans in consultation and building consensus with these communities about how we can help them do transition. Now, this is a process that is not going to happen overnight, and I think one of the lessons that we have learned is that it should not happen overnight. We should not be shocking communities, and we should not be shocking workers that will be suddenly out of a job and without livelihoods. It is important that we prepare for a transition, and in some cases, this is a process that will take a few years, or in some other cases, several years. So we know how to do that. We have the framework, and I encourage you to look at some of our reports on just transition. We just recently, if you land on the World Bank's energy front page, you will see some of the work that recently we have been doing with support from the European Commission in Poland. And you will see how we have been engaging with communities, consulting with them, try to establish the baselines, try to think together with communities, local governments, regional governments, central governments, and then the European Union governing bodies on how we can do this transition. So, in conclusion, what I would like to say is that, first of all, this is something that we must do. We have to do this. We have to do it as quickly as we can, but it is important that we take care of the people that are associated with these facilities. We need to also, in some cases, make sure that we properly address investors, and if they're going to be facing significant losses, we have to find a way of fairly helping them to overcome the losses. And if there's a silver lining, the silver lining that we have seen is that we looked, for instance, at a notional coal power plant in India. And what we have found out that even if you shut it completely, there is a lot of remaining value in the location of the plant, in the network. In many cases, there's a lot of land that goes with the power plant. And what we've been doing as a case of real example with our first project in decommissioning a coal power plant in South Africa, where we have seen a really great example of how you try to build consensus across all this. One of the real good things that we're doing in South Africa is that we're using the repurposing of the Komati power plant to install modern batteries, leverage its position in the network, and then Eskom, our partner there, is using the land to bring in clean energy in. And all of that has value that makes things much more possible. And I think this is the first one we're doing. There's still a lot of learning that we need to go through, but it is important that we do it in a way that becomes faster. Hopefully the short-term energy security crisis that we're having, we will overcome it, and the way to overcome it is to do much more and much faster on clean energy. Thank you.
Much bigger than me. Thank you, Dimitrios, for these insights and what you have been doing in the last years, and one thing that you said, we need to plan ahead, and I think that is something that we will now also hear about different plans. And I would like now to give the word to Ditte Juel Jørgensen, Director General for Energy at the European Commission, for your keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for that. Thank you very much, Demetrius, for your introductory remarks. And thank you to all panelists for joining. And thank you to our audience for being here at COP27, but also thank you to the online audience for being here at this critical event, because just transition is at the center of how we address the climate crisis. It is a necessary part of all the work we do to meet our commitments as agreed in Paris, and it is a necessary part of the energy transition. So what I would like to do here is to outline how do we approach it in the European Union. Demetrius has told about the cooperation with the World Bank, and we are grateful for that excellent cooperation and how that helps bring just transition, not just in the European Union, but really also globally in the regions that need that. Just transition is key for our European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is our plan for how to become climate neutral in 2050 and how to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 55% before 2030. So as part of that, the transition of the regions that need to change, that are key in this change, is absolutely crucial from a social perspective, from a climate perspective, and again, from an energy perspective. Our goal in the European Union is to make sure that we leave no one behind, no region behind, no person behind. We want to make sure that the transition benefits as many people as possible, and I think those objectives are equally valid at global level and in how we from the European Union engage with our global partners. We are now, globally and in the European Union, in an energy crisis. So we have to make sure that we address this energy crisis and the climate crisis in a way that keeps our strategic objective of climate neutrality, that we do not slow down our transition, but rather that we accelerate, that we go full in on the energy transition to address the urgent climate crisis and to help us out of the energy crisis. And it's clear that in order to do that, we have to lower the share of fossil in our energy systems, we have to accelerate the shift to renewables, and we have to become more energy efficient, lower our consumption overall through savings. And this is a complete reshaping of the European energy system, but also of the global energy system in the years to come, starting right now, immediately. For us, renewable energy, as I said, is a critical component of our transition. We have set ourselves a target for 2030 that's currently discussed with member states. But before we had reached agreement on our 40% target, we have said, no, let's up the target to 45%, because we are in an energy crisis and because we are in a climate crisis. So we need to repower our European energy system, and we do that by accelerating work for more renewables, by accelerating work to be more energy efficient and to create new solutions, also for the regions that will need to change out of dependency on coal or dependency on fossil or energy-intensive production. So it is more important now than ever to really act jointly and to learn from each other where we have experience in the European Union that we can share with global partners, working with the World Bank and others. Let us try to do that, because we are better at getting there when we do it together. And I think that's the first lesson from how we are approaching just transition within the European Union is regions across Europe learn from each other. And what we learn from across Europe, from within Europe, we share with our neighbors, Western Balkans, for example, and we share with others globally, including in the important cooperation with the World Bank. So my first message is, let us work together and let us learn from each other in what we do in making the best just transition so that everyone can benefit from the changes we're undergoing. We do a lot of things in order to accelerate the transition and accelerate the change in our energy system that is necessary. We have proposed new rules for permitting so that you can more swiftly build up and scale up renewables across the European Union. We are introducing new rules on heat pumps, geothermal, solar thermal, so that we again can scale up these technologies to become more important in our energy system. We have got onshore and offshore wind. There will be other events about that later today that can contribute massively to our 2030 and 2050 targets. Overall, the power sector, which is critical in the decarbonization. We aim that to be 69% renewable by 2030. But we still have coal as part of our power system. We still use coal for electricity generation. And with the gas crisis that has started with the Russian invasion into Ukraine and with the Russian disruption of global gas flows, we are now reverting to coal in some parts of Europe. I want to underline that that is not a change of course. It is a temporary and hopefully short blip on this line towards lower carbon emissions as part of our power system and towards a shift to renewables. So we try to do that as little as possible and as short as possible to make up for the temporary gap in the system while we accelerate shift to renewable and others. And in this context, we see that the regions in Europe that work in coal, that work in peat, that work in oil shale, actually have very significant know-how. They have significant skills, they have labor, they have they have technical skills that can help generate renewable energy in those areas, and that can help build up renewable industries, renewable supply chains, also in what was previously or what is now coal regions or shale regions. So really there is a win-win scenario where you can be part of the change and benefit from the change through cleaner, cheaper energy, but also through cleaner air that results from renewable energy as opposed to fossil energy in our mix. So we need to accelerate this just transition, and I would like to say a few words about how is it that we do that in the European Union, what is the governance around it, what is our approach to just transition in the European Union. In 2020, so just 2 years ago, we put in place a just transition mechanism within the EU so that we have the means to provide targeted support for the regions that need it to make the change from coal, from shale, from oil. We've been able to mobilize almost 60 billion euro for that over the next 7-year period, really to focus on the most affected regions and to look at what is the socio-economic impact, how do we alleviate it, how do we help reskill labor, how do we help people find a way in the new system and benefit from what is a significant change to our societies and our energy systems. So financing is an important part of it. The second point is that, of course, financing in itself is not enough. We have to do things in the right way. And what we're doing here is to focus on technical assistance to the coal regions in transition. So to help them identify new projects, prepare new projects, prepare clean energy or energy efficiency projects, design the research and innovation, because we need new technology to get there, so as to overall facilitate the transition and do it in a way that helps create jobs and benefits the regions that otherwise risk being left behind as part of what is a very swift and necessarily accelerated transition towards a cleaner world. The third point I wanted to mention, in addition to financing and the technical assistance, is that we have created platforms where actors, where operators can come together and exchange best practices, exchange what they have learned. So again, this notion of working together and learning from each other, emulating what works, is really a critical point in the way we approach it in the European Union and in the way we like to work with global partners so that we can all learn from each other. We have a program called Exchange EU to that effect. It works with local authorities and stakeholders from across the European Union in the regions that have been working in coal, peat and oil shale. And then the fourth point I want to mention in all of this is that while we need to learn from projects from one region to another, we also have to be ready to adapt the projects, to adapt the approach to the local circumstances. Because a region in northern Finland is different from a region in southern Spain, is different from a region in Bulgaria. And so we have to look at what are the local conditions in these lignite regions in Greece or coal regions in Poland, and how do we best help these specific regions in the changes that they are undergoing. So adapting to the specific needs of the region, whether that is a region in the European Union, whether it's a region in one of our neighboring countries, or whether it's a region somewhere else in the world in working with global partners. And that is my fifth point in how we approach it. How do we work with global partners in this? Some of this has already been said by Demetrios, but let me say just a few words. Now, I have mentioned our very close cooperation with the Western Balkans in this, and the reason I do that is that this is our neighboring region together with Ukraine and Moldova. We have energy systems, electricity systems that are integrated and synchronized, and so we can benefit from the changes, from the developments that happen in Europe and in our neighboring countries. It benefits everyone as we do that together. So that is a critical point for us to work closely with our neighbours. But we, of course, also look beyond our immediate neighbours and look at how can we work with global partners around a just transition. What can we share that may be helpful from others, and what can we learn from others about their transition, how they have approached it, and what are the challenges that they face. Again, we are in a global crisis, we're in a global climate crisis, we're in a global energy crisis, and we can only solve this global crisis together at global level and as partners in the right settings. So we are developing also a global platform for coal regions in transition, which will cover not just, obviously, the European Union, not just the countries in our immediate neighbourhood, but really help having a global platform that offers a channel for regions across the world to share knowledge on policies, to share knowledge on approaches, to share best practices and projects, to see, again, what can we all learn from each other. In addition to this specific platform that we're setting up with one of our member states, with Germany, we're also working with other G7 partners under the Just Transition Energy Partnership, which has been set up really to assemble partners together so that we support the Just Transition process in partner countries. And as was mentioned, we've been working with South Africa in that context with the first Just Transition Energy Partnership launched in South Africa at COP26 last year. The G7 presidency, the current G7 presidency, is advancing further these partnerships with other countries. And so under this G7 Just Transition Energy Partnership umbrella, we're also now negotiating, working with Indonesia, with India, with Senegal, and with Vietnam. So a lot is happening across the world, and interesting outcomes, again, interesting lessons learned from each other. The success of all these partnerships and of this global work will, of course, depend on our ability to work together, to come together, our openness and sharing experiences, sharing challenges and sharing solutions, but of course also our ability to be ambitious, our readiness to be ambitious and set the right regulatory framework to make the transition work for everyone across the world. Within the European Union, we have adopted an external energy strategy, and that external energy strategy gives priority to this commitment to the global green and just energy transition. It gives priority to working with others to lower our consumption, to increase our energy savings and our energy efficiency, so that we can help reduce prices, reduce pressure on global energy markets, but also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are linked to energy production and consumption, because that is at the core of the work to reduce climate change and reduce the global emissions, boosting renewables, boosting green hydrogen, and again, energy efficiency as the absolutely critical part of this. So we remain within the European Union committed to working with partners across the world, including through the G7, including through our own platforms in our neighbourhood and beyond, to build the partnerships and ensure that this is embedded in the global financial system as well, because to come back to my first point in the list, financing is obviously critical to make this happen, which is also a reason we're so glad that we have the very good cooperation with the World Bank in this. And then my last point is to come back to this local issue, the fact that we need to make sure we adapt solutions to the local level, and that is why this can only be done when we cooperate with regions, with countries, with local stakeholders, to make sure that solutions are built into the local reality there. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ditte, in giving us this great overview of all the initiatives and programs that the EU is pushing forward. And you have mentioned the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, and maybe also a little bit in terms of time, I would go over to Joanne Javic, head of the Just Energy Transition Partnership Secretariat in South Africa. Joanne, how the JETP was introduced last year at COP, so it's 1 year since then. Can you give us a little bit of an insight what has happened since Glasgow?
Thank you, Moritz. And I'll try and be as quick as I can. If I overshoot my time, you'll stop me.
No, all good.
And good morning to everybody. It's great to be here. The EU is one of the partners in the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa. And so we have worked with the EU in quite a lot of depth over the last year. So let me explain a little bit about what we agreed in Glasgow, firstly, and what has happened in the past year. So the partnership that was agreed to in Glasgow last year between the EU, the US, the UK, France, and Germany, and the government of South Africa, essentially, if you take all of the words away, said that South Africa had committed to an ambitious NDC, and that in order to support South Africa's achievement of that ambitious NDC, there would be a partnership was formed that would be backed by the mobilization of around $8.5 billion, and that would then be used to be able to support the achievement of that NDC. And I think important to understand is that the way South Africa's NDC is structured is in a range. So we have a top range, and then we have a bottom range. And the top range is around 420 megatons equivalent. In our context, we think it puts us on a 2-degree global warming trajectory. At the bottom of the range, it's 350. Very hard, we think, for us to achieve within the time frames, but that then is 1.5 degree consistent. So the partnership is intended to support South Africa moving towards the bottom end of that range and achieving its NDC, not only the more ambitious part of the NDC, but achieving that more rapidly. So what we decided to do, and the Secretariat, I think importantly, was supported by the climate investment funds. A decision was taken that it needed to have South African ownership, which is where I come in and the team that I worked with in South Africa. And we proceeded to work with to undertake the technical and coordination work around it. The structures, we had our cabinet and an interministerial committee on climate change overseeing the work. They in turn appointed a presidential climate finance task team under the leadership of Mr. Daniel Manele, a former governor of the Reserve Bank, and that body then worked with the international partners group around the plan. Maybe to talk about the approach that we took in the plan. We looked at the $8.5 billion, and we looked at what the country would need to do to achieve its climate ambitions. And we said, well, we can see the $8.5 billion is a start. And I think we spoke also about Komati. I think that we're very grateful also to the World Bank and to the government of Canada, who have financed the decommissioning project around the Komati power station, which is outside of the scope of the JETP. And what we said is that the partnership is structured as an initial 3 to 5 year rolling partnership. So the intention is to look at it in 5-year periods. And we said that what we thought would be useful to do in our context would be to look at what we could achieve, what needed to be achieved in the period 2023 to 2027 in order to put the country on the trajectory to be able to achieve its NDC ambitions, looking at 3 sectors only: the electricity sector, electric vehicles, and green hydrogen. And that was what was agreed in the partnership agreement. And so what we went on to do was to describe a scale of need in the 2023 to 2027 period that would put South Africa firmly in the direction of meeting its NDC by 2030. And in that description of the scale of need, what we identified is that in actual fact what we need is $90 billion as a country, and that we looked at how the $8.5 billion would then support and initiate and catalyze and get us on the direction to be able to mobilize that $90 billion. Of which, by the way, I think it's very important to say our assessment is that probably another 40% of that amount would come from the private sector, and a large proportion, in fact, from the private sector in South Africa. So we're not looking for sort of $98 billion of public money. We're looking at how the private and the public sector interface and interact with each other, but also importantly how the government in itself in South Africa and public finances start being directed towards this plan. So we then have put out a plan that essentially in the bulk of the funding that is required, we're looking at in the electricity sector, and we're looking at three critical areas. The first is repurposing and repowering, and our country energy plan looks at 22 gigawatts of power, coal power being decommissioned by around 2035. That's about half of our installed capacity. So a very big ask in the context of the overall system. And so the repurposing and repowering of power stations, similar, and building on the Komati experience becomes a very important part of that plan. The second important part of the electricity plan is really around transmission. Our transmission network in certain parts of the country, and particularly where the country's solar and wind resources are the best, has no grid capacity left in the northern and the eastern Cape. And so a critical element of this plan is to be able to build out the transmission grid and to modernize the transmission grid as well as the distribution grid in order to be able to have a grid that is fit for purpose and that would facilitate the private sector coming in and building renewables in the parts of the country where the renewables resource is best. And then the third part of the plan is really about building solar, wind, storage, looking at the potential of green hydrogen, and looking at how one would bring in essentially what is a largely private sector investment. I think important to say is that, and I'm sure that a number of you will have heard our president's comments made both at when we handed over the investment plan to the IPG last Monday, and our president said that fundamentally, I think we are very grateful for this partnership. I think that what it has achieved is to get South Africa to concretize and to bring down to a granular level of detail and understanding of what is required. But I do think that one of the disappointments has been in the very low level of grant finance in this plan, and I think that is critically important because of the just transition elements. In a country like South Africa, not only with its deeply coal-embedded economy, but with very high levels of poverty and unemployment, and the fact that if a worker loses a job, their route into another job is not at all secure. The issues of what we need to do around the just transition, how we provide social support, how we reskill and retrain, how we redeploy workers, how we diversify the economy and provide new opportunities, particularly for young people coming into the labor force into the future, and how we create a different future for disadvantaged people becomes absolutely critical to the success of any energy transition partnership. And a lot of those investments are not commercial investments. And so I think that one of the things in these just energy transition partnerships going forward has to be a very serious consideration around what is the infrastructure finance that is needed, that is loan finance. Where can concessional finance support the achievement of more? How do we leverage the private sector, but also how internationally we mobilize a much greater proportion of grant finance in order that we can really, with a great deal of seriousness, advance the just transition elements of the plan and be able to get traction and currency and be able to ensure that there is a seamless transition so that those promises are kept. And our concern is that if you don't, we will set back the achievement of climate targets and the ability to transition in developing countries quite seriously. So I think that those are just some of the issues that I wanted to raise. Just to say the investment plan is out. It's on our presidency's website. I think we'll start distributing it at the COP. We are looking, I know there are many other European countries who are interested in this partnership and have spoken to the IPG or spoken to our government. Where we are now is starting the process of developing the implementation plan for the JETP. And really, I think what's going to be important is to say, how do we keep this partnership going? How do we broaden and widen it? How do we collaborate with the other countries that are interested? But above all, how do we deliver on its promises really rapidly? Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. This is really interesting to hear, and I think what you're saying is that there are a lot of experiences that you have made, and that others can learn from. And German State Secretary just mentioned in an interview that these just energy transition partnerships can be a quality seal for a just energy transition. And I guess also South Africa could be something like a blueprint for other JETPs to follow. Do you see that as a quality seal?
I think that there is significant potential from these partnerships. And I certainly think that there is the potential for them to be, I don't want to say replicated, but spread across the world. I think it is a good thing to do in a developing country. I do think, though, each country's context is different. So I think that what we are going to see as more and more countries come on board in relation to these plans, one is going to have to develop them in a way that really speaks to country NDCs, to local circumstances and issues. So yes, I think process-wise, we've got a lot to share, and content-wise, they're going to vary quite significantly. Thanks.
Thank you. And one country that might be the first where you can share experience with is Indonesia, and I would like to welcome Suya Dharma, chairman of the Indonesian Renewable Energy Committee for Abindo, with us. And in Indonesia, I think we have quite a challenging situation. Coal provides more than 60% of electricity production, and Indonesia is also one of the largest, if not the largest, coal exporter in the world. But nevertheless, you've signed commitments to exit coal, and you're also the next candidate for the JETP, and I don't know if it's published already today or any other day now, but could you articulate how you plan this such a transition in a country which is so heavily reliant on coal?
Thank you very much. This is good morning to everybody. I would like to thank to very important event today for the EU Energy Day. I'm coming from the actually it's private sector, non-government, but we are collaborating very closely with the government on the energy transition, mainly and how to get the net zero emission by, our ambition target by 2060. So, as the government of Indonesia has declared in Glasgow last year, that our target and our ambitions to achieve the net zero emission is by 2060 or even earlier. That means, of course, we need a lot of collaboration in that in order to achieve the net zero emission earlier. But what we have done in the last, let's say in the last 20 or 25 years, our energy is much more dependent on the fossil, you know. Mostly it's come from oil and gas because we are, before is the biggest exporter, the biggest producer of gas in the world. But right now, you know, since the last 5 years, we are also importing the gas from the other countries. So this is what we are facing. Even for the oil and gas, also before, almost 60% of energy using are use oil, you know, even for electricity, for the transportation, for industry, etc. But since the last 5 or 10 years, everything we are going to change, you know, to change. Actually, since 2007, when we established what we call it energy law, in which the renewable energy are prioritized, you know, to convert from fossil into renewable energy. But a lot of you know, we have to face because of the electricity ratio for the countries is in the last, let's say in the last 10 years is very, very low, less than 60%. So that's why on that time, we try to push to use the coal, you know, to facilitate the people in order to increase the electricity ratio for the countries. And now the electricity ratio is, I think, almost 100%, let's say, you know. But mostly what we use is coal power plant. About 67%, I think, is coal. Then we still have used oil, gas. The total is about 88%, you know. Only 12% is come from the renewable energy. This is a bit tricky because what we declared in Glasgow last year, we have to achieve the net zero emission by 2060, while we are in the country still using 60%, 67% of coal, you know. So in which the carbon emission is very, very big, you know, come from the coal. So what we are going to do now is try to make a roadmap in order to achieve the net zero emission by 2060 by reducing the coal into renewable energy by time to time, starting from 2025. 2025, we are going to stop to develop a new power plant come from coal, you know. Then we are going to reduce about 9 gigawatt from coal-fired plant by 2030. Then, you know, every single 5 years, we're going to replace the coal-fired plant at least 5 to 10 gigawatt. The last using of the coal-fired plant is by 2056. So hopefully by 2060, the net zero emission is achieved. You know. But of course, the problem for this is how to finance the project, you know, because in our calculation, the total financing for this energy transition is about almost $1 trillion US. You know, this is really big. I think last year's World Bank has studied how to, the just transition from the fossil into the renewable energy. But we are not, I think we are not concluded at all. But on the progress, we have to think how to transit from the fossil into the renewable energy. Of course, I think the collaboration between World Bank, European Commission, I think this is really what we needed in the next 20 or 30 years. Maybe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One question, because you're mentioning it's just such a great challenge to move away, and we've heard Dita said it in the beginning that we really need to include the workers, their families. There's whole regions which have been dependent on fossil fuels for decades. People have been asked to come to rural areas just to work in those regions, and I think it's deeply rooted in their tradition. How do you tackle this issue in Indonesia?
I think this is a very, very big challenge, because of the almost mostly the people are depending on the fossil fuel, mainly on the coal industries, in the countries. Even informally, leader communities is depend on the fossil and mainly from the coal business activities. So we don't know how to, I think we have to train them first, how to move forward from fossil fuel into the renewable energy. Actually, the renewable energy will create, I think, million of jobs, in the countries. But the problem, they are limited on the knowledge, limited on the behavior, to use. But mostly, renewable energy is more on the digitalization, mostly using the technologies, etc. But the people, most of the people are at the middle to the lower level, How to move from the lower level into the middle and then from the middle into the upper level. I think we are now, in Bali, we have a G20 summit, and we are going to declare about the, what we call it, Bali Compact. Maybe Bali Compact will solve that kind of event. Tomorrow will be, launch the Bali Compact.
Okay, thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes left, but Dimitris, I wanted to ask you one question. And now hearing what the EU has on offer, what is going on in South Africa and Indonesia, what broader measures would you propose to replicate that success of EU fundings and financing support mechanism? What can we learn? How can we replicate that?
So I think it is important to recognize that we are, in a way, we're taking the first steps on a long trip, which is quite urgent. And it is necessary that as we start implementing things, we capture the lessons and we work in partnership. I think this is definitely a key consideration. Joan correctly mentioned that, and we actually saw this very explicitly when we worked with the government of South Africa for the decommissioning of Komati. There is, and that project is roughly, say, about $500 million. And about 450 or so million, 440, are investments in repurposing the coal power plant, in the decommissioning, in in restituting environmental impacts of the land around it. And we think that these are the investments that really have economic returns. But then there is another about $40 to $50 million that when we did our own economic analysis, and these are the spending that goes into helping communities transition and into looking at how we can help the region of Mpumalanga economically diversify away from the coal dependency for revenues. These types of investments do not really have an economic revenue. So when we're asking governments like the government of Indonesia or the government of South Africa, in the future it's going to be in India, in Poland, in the Western Balkans, there needs to be a recognition that these are actually costs, and that these are costs that we have to find a way to finance them in a fair way for the countries that go through the transition and their communities. And my view is that in terms of next steps, what we have to figure out is a way of better unlocking the carbon credit markets to direct some of the flows into dealing with these issues where we cannot easily get economic revenues. I think this is a challenge that we have in front of us. Carbon credit markets are definitely lagging way behind where they should be. And we all need to do much more to get them going. And I would argue that making sure that some of the funds that will flow, hopefully, through credit markets can be properly directed into the socioeconomic investments of the just transition to make them happen. And I think this will really help, especially developing countries, to move faster into that. We have work to do on that. We're launching on the World Bank what we call the SCALE initiative, which is trying to revive carbon credit markets. And we work in partnership with our donors. But I think we have a lot of work to do there, and we have to find a way to unlock this type of funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Demetrius. We're at the top of the hour, but before we close, Dita, I want to give the last word to you. And you mentioned that we need to share with our global partners. Nobody needs to learn from scratch because there is so much experience. And while country contexts are different, of course, there is still a lot to share. Listening to today's session, what do you think the EU can furthermore share with their global partners, but also what can the EU learn from other partners?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think already listening over this last hour, we have learned, I think, inspiring stories from Indonesia about how you go about what is a very, very significant change given your very high level of dependence on fossil and own production, which obviously gives a certain particular challenge, and the same from South Africa. So I think that coming together is already very important. Then I think what Demetrius has said, the distinction between investments that is making your investments work, that bring revenues, that bring benefits both into the local community, but also in the help of building supply chains, building industrial infrastructures, building jobs. That is one part of the investment that is needed. And as you have said, Joanna, a lot of that will come from private investments. It makes sense to use private funding for that. But then as we also have to recognize there are other parts of the financing needed that is more of a cost because it is a help, it is a social aspect of this. And so we need to look at how do we best balance that and get the best possible results out of that. And how do we make sure that the way we go about it increases the return, the revenue, the changes that are necessary, and decreases the continued need for what is capital that is not working, so to say, that is necessary as part of the transition, but not working. And there, I think some of the experience we have had within the European Union might be of interest to other partners. We've got regions that were heavily coal dependent, really with coal mines, with the economy centered around coal extraction and coal power. And looking at the changes there, whether the industry, whether the manufacturing and the skills and the jobs have moved into battery production or e-vehicles, e-public transport, or into renewable energy, photovoltaic and wind, then those experiences are critical because you use some of the same skills, some of the same technology, or at least that reskilling is possible and can be done fairly swiftly. So I think there is some very concrete experience to share. I think, Joanna, you put it very well when you talked about the fact that these partnerships really concretize and help us develop at a granular level what is it that is needed. Because the principles are fairly easy to express, but the translation into the what does it mean concretely, how do we make it operational, how do we make it work on the ground in the villages, in the regions, in the towns, how do we make it work in the education and professional training facilities so that we help reskill our labor, and how do we learn again from each other. Some of your plans for renewables are similar to ours, and we've done different things to get there, and we can probably do more together. So as you've also said, I think the Bali Compact coming out later this week is encouraging and promising, and we will work together also with G20 partners around the implementation of that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Many thanks to our panelists and speaker. It has been a very interesting session, and I think there's a lot more discussions to come and to hear. I'm very curious to hear what is happening in Indonesia. So yeah, everybody have a good day. Thank you very much.